August 1945, Luzon Island. The air was thick enough to taste. A sun so cruel it burned the bamboo shadows flat against the dirt. Japanese women prisoners, weak from days of heat and hunger, stood in two uneven lines. Then came a sound no one mistook, the sharp bark of an American sergeant. Strip for inspection. At first no one moved. The translator blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. The command came again, louder this time, bouncing off the tin roofs and watchtowers. Strip for inspection, boots shifted, clipboards snapped open, and something inside that dusty parade ground cracked, not the air, but the trust that surrender was supposed to bring. There were roughly 3,500 Japanese civilians interned in the Philippine camps. About 40% were women, nurses, teachers, farmers' wives, none of them trained for humiliation. One woman whispered, "They said Americans were civilized." Another clutched the collar of her torn uniform, as if cloth could stop what was coming. From the guards' side, no laughter, only tension. Even they looked uneasy, as if obeying orders they didn't believe in. Somewhere behind them, a typewriter clacked in a hut, recording the day like it was just another medical check. The women's feet dug into the mud. One tried to cover herself with her arms, trembling. The interpreter's voice shook as he translated again, apologetically. And then the first blouse fell. Buttons scattered into the dirt like tiny bones. The silence was unbearable, the kind that hums louder than gunfire. One guard muttered, "Rules are rules," but no one answered. The air carried only the sound of breathing, slow, ragged, human. From that moment, the line between health inspection and humiliation blurred beyond repair. What started as procedure turned into something else, something that would echo through diaries, testimonies, and nightmares for decades. If you were standing there, what would you have done? And hey, before we go deeper into this story, tell me in the comments from which city and at what time are you watching this? I'm genuinely curious who's listening right now, because what happened next in that same blazing courtyard would make even one American nurse question everything she'd been taught about mercy. The sun hadn't moved. It still pressed down like punishment, turning sweat into a second skin. One clipboard snapped open, a small sound, but it cut through the silence like a blade. The American medics stepped forward, pretending this was routine. They called it a sanitation check. The women knew better. Bare feet shifted on the gravel, dust stuck to skin. A few tried to turn their backs, but the guards circled them slowly, eyes like searchlights. Every motion was documented, height, weight, hair inspection, except dignity, which no one measured. Camp records from that time describe these sessions as medical hygiene inspections, twice per week. But eyewitnesses say those notes hide the truth. The routine felt surgical in its precision, but psychological in its cruelty. Each woman's body became a report, stripped of name, reduced to data. A medic's pen scratched against paper. One wrote "no lice." Another wrote "rash." One older woman, maybe in her late 40s, tried to hide her shaking hands. The interpreter whispered to her gently, "It will be over soon," but even he couldn't look her in the eye. It wasn't just exposure, it was erasure. These women, who had survived bombings, starvation, and surrender, now stood powerless in peacetime. The war had ended officially, but humiliation has its own afterlife. Across the yard, a young American nurse, Lieutenant Grace Allen, watched from behind the medic tent flap. Her face was pale, jaw locked. She had followed orders for years, patched up soldiers, followed protocols. But something about this inspection twisted her gut. She turned away when one woman covered her face and whispered, "Please." And that's when it hit her. If Mercy doesn't survive victory, what does? The inspection dragged on, 2 hours of paperwork disguised as procedure. And when it ended, the women were handed thin medical sheets, cleared, stamped in blue ink, as if ink could erase what eyes had done. No punishment followed, no violence, no marks, yet something deeper had been broken. Grace Allen stepped out into the yard as the women gathered their clothes. She met one prisoner's eyes and couldn't look away. It was a silent exchange of shame neither side could name. That look would haunt her, because the next day she'd be ordered to do it again. Lieutenant Grace Allen didn't sleep that night. The jungle outside hummed with crickets and rain tapping the canvas roof, but inside her tent the silence was heavier than thunder. Her hands still trembled from what she'd seen, not from fear but from conflict. She had served since 1940. 2 patched-up dying men followed orders without question. Yet this one command, strip them for inspection, gnawed at her like infection. Morning came with military precision, réveil at 6, coffee thick as oil, orders pinned to the bulletin board. And there it was again, her name on the roster for medical oversight, female compound, same task. Same shame. Grace's stomach turned. She wasn't naive. She'd seen brutality on both sides. But something about this felt wrong in a quieter, crueler way. It wasn't violence. It was humiliation disguised as procedure, a violation stamped with bureaucracy's approval. She walked across the yard, clipboard clutched tight. The air smelled of bleach and wet bamboo. The women stood waiting again, silent, faces expressionless. But their eyes, those eyes, burned with understanding. They knew it wasn't about health anymore. It was about control. Grace's assistant whispered, "Ma'am, should we proceed?" She hesitated. A second of defiance flickered, small but real. "Document temperature and pulse only," she said sharply. The corporal frowned. "Ma'am, full inspections protocol." She looked him dead in the eye. "Not today." In her logbook later, she wrote something that wouldn't be read for 50 years. Procedure complete. No further exposure necessary. Even one of the Japanese women noticed. She told another in hushed Japanese. The nurse turned away. And that moment, that tiny act of mercy, spread quietly through the compound like rumor. That evening, Grace wrote a letter she never sent. "I thought we were here to heal, not to shame. Orders don't change what's right." She sealed it in an envelope and hid it in her footlocker. But paperwork doesn't disappear in war. Her deviation from protocol would reach her commanding officer within days. The next morning, she'd be summoned for clarification. And as she straightened her uniform and stepped out into the sticky dawn, the camp around her, the fences, the guards, the smoke from the cookhouse, all seemed to whisper one question: what side of mercy are you really on? By nightfall, the same camp that smelled of bleach and fear by day now smelled of stew and wood smoke. From the outside, it looked calm, the war over, the victors humane. But inside those bamboo fences, contradictions thrived like weeds. The women POW sat cross-legged, eating from tin bowls. The broth was thin but warm, lentils, rice, a sliver of meat. One of them murmured, "Better than we had in Japan." And it was true. American rations averaged 2,200 calories per day, the same as their own soldiers got. On paper, equality, in practice an uneven mercy. Across the yard, guards played cards under a lantern. Cigarette smoke coiled lazily upward, mingling with the tropical air. A young corporal laughed too loudly at a joke one found funny. The same hands that had ordered women to undress now dealt spades and poured whiskey. Grace Allen watched from the infirmary steps. Her conscience itched under the skin, invisible but constant. She couldn't reconcile the two realities, the inspection she'd refused to perform and the dinner rations handed out like goodwill. Humanity on the menu, humiliation on the record. The Japanese women whispered among themselves. They didn't hate their captors, they pitied them. They feed us like equals after stripping us bare. One said quietly that paradox stung more than hunger. A child, the youngest among them, maybe 10, giggled when a guard tossed her a candy bar. The sound broke the tension for a heartbeat. But even sweetness here came wrapped in power. Grace's friend, a field medic named Larson, joined her on the steps. "You did the right thing," he said softly. "Nobody talks about it, but we all saw." Grace exhaled, her gaze fixed on the flickering campfire. Doing right doesn't feel like much out here. In the distance, a Filipino woman, one of the civilian helpers, whispered to her husband through the fence. Rumors were already forming, twisting truth into punishment stories. "They say the Americans are teaching them a lesson," she said. He frowned. "That's not teaching, that's shame." By morning, those whispers would reach the village, and from there, the world beyond the barbed wire. And in the tangled lines of rumor and truth, the humiliation would multiply. The next day, the fence itself would become the messenger. The morning broke with the restless energy of gossip. Fog rolled low across the camp, curling around the barbed wire like breath. Beyond that fence, Filipino civilians whispered, traded glances, and passed along what they thought was news. Japanese women are being punished. Each retelling added something darker, new details, new shame. Inside the compound, the prisoners didn't know the stories were spreading. They simply felt the stares. Locals who once brought coconuts and rice now walked by faster, avoiding eye contact. The camp had become its own rumor machine, powered by silence. War distorts truth faster than radio waves. There were around 14 internment camps scattered across the Philippines, each with its own set of secrets. But this one, this women's compound, had crossed an invisible line. The forced inspections were meant to ensure cleanliness, yet they became symbols of defeat, humiliation, and revenge, all tangled together. Grace Allen heard the whispers from a delivery driver at the gate. "They say you make them stand naked in the yard," he said quietly, eyes darting away. Her jaw tightened. "That's not how it happened," she muttered, but even as she said it, she knew the truth wasn't much cleaner. Inside, the Japanese women huddled closer. They heard the rumors too, a kind of echo of their own shame. "Our bodies became their propaganda," one wrote later in her diary, decades after the war. In those days, shame was contagious. The guards didn't talk openly, but everyone could feel it. The camp's mood had shifted. Even meals were quieter now. The prisoners began covering their heads with cloth whenever outsiders passed, trying to reclaim scraps of privacy. That afternoon, Grace walked by the fence and saw a Filipino boy watching her. His expression wasn't angry, just curious, confused. He finally asked, "Are you the one who helps or the one who hurts?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. By sundown, the camp radio crackled with static and a faint song, a love tune from Manila, out of place amid all that tension. Grace listened, wondering if anyone beyond these fences would ever know what really happened. But one man inside the camp already knew too much, and he was about to risk everything to stop it. Private Jack Larson was 21, from a quiet town in Iowa, where people still left doors unlocked. By the time he reached Luzon, that innocence had been burned away. He had seen too much men starving, orders that didn't make sense, and now this, a command that tasted like shame. He stood near the medical tent when the next inspection was announced. The same sergeant from before shouted the routine. "Line them up. Same procedure." Larson froze. His hand twitched near his rifle, but not from fear, from resistance. Something inside him just refused to move. When his commanding officer barked, "You deaf, private," he finally spoke. "Sir, this ain't inspection. This is humiliation." The air went still. A few medics looked up, eyes wide. The sergeant's face hardened. "You questioning orders, son?" Larson didn't blink. "If orders make us forget we're human, then yeah, I'm questioning." The camp rulebook was clear. Disobedience could mean 6 months confinement, even court-martial. But Larson didn't care. He walked away from the line, boots crunching over gravel, heart pounding like a drumbeat of rebellion. Behind him, the inspection carried on, but the mood had cracked. Even the guards avoided looking too long. That night, he sat by the perimeter fence, cigarette burning low, trying to make sense of what he'd done. Grace Allen found him there. "You just painted a target on your back," she warned softly. He shrugged. Someone had to blink first. She looked at him, really looked, and for a fleeting moment, she didn't feel alone. Word of Larson's defiance spread through the compound. The prisoners noticed. One woman whispered through the translator. The young soldier refused. Another murmured, "Maybe not all of them are cruel." For the first time in days, a sliver of trust flickered among the women. But mercy is never simple in a war built on obedience. The next morning, Larson was reassigned to kitchen duty, a quiet punishment. Officially, it was routine rotation. Unofficially, it was exile. Still, what he did couldn't be unseen. Grace carried his courage like a hidden flame. And in that fragile moment of moral rebellion, something else was brewing. A flash, a sound, a camera clicking in the shadows. It began with a single click, a sound too sharp for the humid stillness of the camp, the kind of sound that made heads turn. Someone, somewhere behind the inspection line, had taken a photograph. Grace Allen froze mid-step. Across the yard, Japanese women were lined up again, stripped of choice, lined by order. But this time, she saw a glint of sunlight bounce off metal near the guard tower, the unmistakable flash of a camera lens. The sergeant's voice cut through the air. "Who authorized photography?" No one answered. The medic beside Grace cursed under his breath. They all knew photos were forbidden, but in every war, some men couldn't resist trophies. Later, witnesses would say the picture showed nothing explicit. Just women turned away from the camera, half-covered, heads bowed. But the intent, that dark curiosity, was enough to stain everyone present. It turned humiliation into spectacle. By the time the officers found the culprit, the damage was already done. The roll of film passed through 2 hands before reaching the sergeant's desk. Then came the order: destroy it. Burn the negatives, silence the witnesses. Officially, the incident never happened. Unofficially, it became legend inside the camp. The soldiers whispered, "Somebody's got proof." The prisoners whispered too, wondering which moment of theirs had been frozen forever. Grace couldn't shake the image, not the photo, but the act itself. That click haunted her dreams. She imagined the photographer's smirk, the camera shutter snapping like judgment. When she finally asked Larson if he knew who it was, he nodded once. A corporal named Henson bragged about it after lights out. She wanted to report it, but reports didn't survive long in camps where shame was the currency. Instead, she wrote one line in her logbook: "Unethical conduct observed, photographic breach." Small words, enormous weight. The next morning, Henson was transferred for medical reassignment. A translation, buried by paperwork. The photograph vanished, supposedly burned in the medic pit behind the barracks. But rumor said one copy survived, hidden in someone's footlocker. And that rumor, that grainy ghost of truth, would become the first clue that reached the Red Cross months later. The news of that hidden photograph didn't vanish, it drifted, like smoke through the military chain, like rumor through letters home. And by the time it reached Manila Command, it carried a new label, potential violation of Geneva standards. That phrase was enough to make even the brass nervous. Weeks later, under a sun bleached to white, 3 trucks rolled up to the camp gates. The guards stiffened. The visitors wore armbands marked with a red cross. The Geneva inspectors had arrived, clipboards in hand, cameras, official ones, dangling from their necks. For the first time, the camp looked unsettled in a different way. Fear of exposure, not of enemies. Everything changed overnight. The women were given blankets, hair combs, even soap. The barracks were scrubbed, floors mopped, fences retied. It was theater disguised as compassion. Grace Allen could see the panic behind every sudden act of kindness. "So now they remember we're human," one prisoner murmured. During the inspection, the Red Cross officer, a tall Swiss man with immaculate handwriting, asked to see medical logs. Grace handed him her binder. He flipped through the pages, paused at one note, her quiet protest written weeks earlier. No further exposure necessary. His eyes met hers. He didn't speak, but he nodded slightly, as if to say, "I see you." The inspectors photographed everything: rations, bedding, infirmary equipment. The guards smiled nervously, the sergeant sweating through his uniform. For that single day, the camp resembled decency. But truth has a way of bleeding through paperwork. After the inspection, the Red Cross team gathered under a tent, typing their findings on a portable typewriter. Grace lingered nearby, heart hammering. She knew the hidden photograph hadn't been mentioned, but her conscience wouldn't let it die quietly. That night, under lantern light, she wrote a letter and sealed it in an envelope marked for International Committee Archives. Inside, she described everything: the forced inspections, the humiliation, the fear. She slipped it to the Swiss officer during breakfast. He accepted it without a word, tucking it into his briefcase like contraband. For the first time in months, Grace felt something close to relief. But she didn't know that her letter, her single act of truth, was already doomed to vanish inside bureaucracy. Because once the Red Cross left, the command ordered a full review of camp records, and that meant one thing: silence was about to be rewritten as order. The Red Cross trucks left before dawn, engines humming softly as they rolled down the dirt road. The camp looked ordinary again, quiet, tense, pretending. Grace Allen stood by the fence and watched their taillights vanish into the mist. For a heartbeat, she believed her letter might change something. But bureaucracy moves slower than conscience. Weeks passed. No word came. The camp's routines resumed. The same rations, the same roll calls, the same uneasy coexistence. The women still whispered about the camera, the inspections, the nurse who had looked away. Grace's logbook gathered dust. And then, one humid morning, a courier arrived from headquarters with a sealed envelope marked confidential. Inside was a single sheet: inspection concluded, no violations recorded. Her stomach dropped. That was it. Her letter, the witness statements, the diary excerpts she'd helped translate, all erased. Filed, sealed, and buried. Later, she'd learned that out of 17,000 Allied war crimes and conduct files, more than 5,000 were locked away, classified beyond reach. History was being curated, tidied up for the peace that followed. In Tokyo, during the war crimes trials, aides received fragments of the Red Cross findings. But the sections about Japanese female POW were conveniently omitted, too politically messy, too morally gray. Grace's name never appeared. For the prisoners, freedom came without apology. When the war officially ended, trucks carried them to Manila for repatriation. Some cried, others stayed silent, "We leave our ghosts here," one woman said. They left behind their bowls, their blankets, and their truth. Grace watched them go, the sound of engines fading into tropical rain. She felt lighter, and yet heavier than she'd ever been. Her conscience had done all it could, and it wasn't enough. She packed her footlocker, tucked away her notes, and shipped home to California. Decades later, in government archives, a historian would find a one-line reference buried in microfilm. Unverified report of improper inspection, Luzon Camp, August 1945. Just that. No names, no context, no justice, and yet that single line, the echo of her letter, would become the spark that led one Japanese-American researcher to start digging half a century later. Because truth, even when buried under silence, waits to be found. Washington, 1998. The basement of the National Archives smelled of dust and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a Japanese-American historian named Eiko Tanaka opened a forgotten gray box labeled Camp Luzon, Miscellaneous Correspondence. Inside were brittle letters, carbon copies, and a single brown envelope marked Confidential Allen G. Her hands shook as she unfolded the first page. Typed neatly with fading ink were the words, "They were not treated as prisoners. They were treated as exhibits." Signed, L.T. Grace M. Allen, Army Nurse Corps. Eiko stopped breathing for a moment. It wasn't just history. It was a voice, cracked, trembling, but alive across time. She read every line. Descriptions of forced inspections, of women trembling in the sun, of orders disguised as health checks. Grace hadn't written to accuse, she'd written to confess. For the next 3 months, Eiko checked every reference. Military logs, Red Cross memos, diary fragments from Japanese survivors, all matched. She found notes about Private Jack Larson, the guard who refused. His name, too, had vanished from official records, but a small personnel form confirmed his reassignment due to moral objection. Only around 100 first-hand accounts from Japanese female POW survived the post. For years, most were unpublished, hidden in family boxes or lost in translation. But Grace's letter tied them together like thread through fabric. Eiko later said in an interview, "I didn't discover a scandal. I discovered humanity trying to survive orders." That became the title of her paper. It circulated quietly at academic conferences, then online, where strangers finally read the words the world had buried for half a century. Across Japan, a few surviving women, old now, faces lined by years, heard about the article. One sent a handwritten note to Eiko. "At last, someone read what we could never say." Grace Allen never knew. She died in 1974, long before her truth resurfaced. But her words outlived her, whispered through the archives, carried into the light by someone who refused to let silence win. History doesn't shout. It hums beneath the noise, waiting for someone to listen closely enough. And sometimes one buried sentence, written by trembling hands in a forgotten war, can make the world remember what mercy truly means.